May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture. Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to episode 13 of Season 3. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This episode, we speak to Ran Levi, producer of Israel's most listened to podcasts, who shares his thoughts on what makes a great podcast and everything that goes with it. But first, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Chris Ashmore.
G'day, Nick. It's good to be back in the studio.
Welcome back.
I've heard Nicole's been doing a great job without me, but at the moment she's in the United States, yeah?
She is at Podcast Movement, the big podcast conference.
That's great. You managed to send her away and put me back in my right place here, maybe. Now, big news. Things are just booming in the world of podcasting at the moment, and they have always been, but particularly right now, Spotify's podcast audience has grown by 50% quarter over quarter, with tens of millions of users streaming podcasts on its platform monthly.
Yeah, they're making a big play, aren't they? And not in Australia, but in other countries, they've overtaken Apple. Just recently, they added Austria, the Czech Republic and Romania, and they already had dominance over Apple in large chunks of Europe, like the Netherlands, Germany, Bulgaria, Spain, as well as Latin America. So they're
incredible what they're doing. And, you know, when you're submitting your podcast to iTunes or Apple Podcasts, it can take, almost 2 weeks now, but submitting it to Spotify only takes a couple of days. So for podcasters, it's becoming easier to get yourself on Spotify.
And they have less podcasts still than Apple, which means you've got a better chance of standing out.
Well, you do, that's right. Other things, Entercom, a large US radio broadcaster, just bought podcast studio Pineapple Street for $18 million, and they also bought Cadence 13, another studio. Advertising and podcasting still going up and up. More than $500 million expected in total advertising dollars in 2019.
I reckon that's conservative too.
I think so too. And 2020 and beyond, it's going to be huge, up to $1 billion probably. So when I hear recently about podcasting hitting its peak, I just think what utter, complete nonsense. As more money pours into podcasting, there'll naturally be better produced podcasts. And so better quality will garner bigger audiences, is what we're seeing. More people listening will then lead to more money. So it's that cycle will just continue. Yeah. So I think my future prediction, just, from now, look out for more comedy podcasts, more sport podcasts, shorter podcasts, more daily podcasts. We're seeing more of them. More original premium podcasts for Stitcher, Audible, Spotify.
Well, and Apple as well have launched. They're going to start making their own content. It's
incredible. Every media outlet will have its own podcast or several podcasts, not just the dailies that we're seeing. In Australia, the Australian has a whole suite of podcasts, or The Age. It's every smaller local newspaper, trade magazines, they will all have their own podcasts. Every school, every member association, government department, interest group with members, they'll have their own podcast.
So is everybody going to have a podcast?
Let me go on. Maybe. Museums, art galleries, we're seeing this at the moment. Churches, book festivals, politicians, business people, not just businesses themselves, but business people, their own branded podcasts, charities, not-for-profits, professional service associations, recruiters, lawyers, accountants, government departments, celebrities. I mean, the celebritization of podcasting is just going on now. It will just go on and on and on. Not every company will warrant having its own podcast, but with more money pumping in, as I said, and podcasts getting better, it'll just mean more people are listening to it. So, have we come to peak podcasting? Not even close. I'd say we haven't seen nothing yet.
I couldn't agree more.
Good.
That was very, very, very passionate.
It was.
You mentioned one thing I just want to pick up on, shorter podcasts. At that point, particularly because it's still the question we get asked more probably than anything else, is how long should my podcast be? And there was an interesting article from Megaphone recently about this. They analysed the length of podcasts in the Apple Top 200 chart over the last few months. And they were looking also at the correlation between when a podcast was first released and its average duration. And they've shown that podcasts that were first produced in 2019, so more recent podcasts, on average are shorter than those that were started 5 years ago back in 2014. In fact, back in 2014, there were almost no 0 to 15-minute podcasts in that chart at all. 5 years ago, 1 to 1.5 hour shows were up around 37% of the chart. Now, just 10%.
There you go.
And shows under 45 minutes that were released in 2019 now make up 73%, whereas it was only 37% back in 2015. So shows are getting shorter, and it highlights, Chris, what you've been saying about the quality of podcasts increasing, which means more editing, more strategy about why you're producing a podcast, and above all, respect for the listener and how busy they are. I would much prefer to listen to 3 10-minute episodes on my way to work than half of a 1 hour show.
That's right.
All right, well, to today's chat, Chris.
Well, Nick, I spoke with Ran Levi. He's the co-founder of podcast Israel Media and producer of Israel's most listened to podcast, Making History. It's in Hebrew. It commands 100,000 downloads per episode. And another popular podcast you might want to listen to for those who don't speak Hebrew is Malicious Life. It's an English one. Now, what drew me to contacting Ran was a series of articles he's written on podcasting best practices. And as you know, Nick, there's a lot of rubbish circulating out there about podcasting.
There is.
And Ran's articles obviously reflect someone who knows what he's doing and he's doing it well, and he's making a business from doing it. So my first question to Ran is how he started in podcasting.
I started making history 12 years ago. I was still in my day job. I was an engineer, a developer. And about 5 or 6 years ago, when Making History began to really make an impact on the national media scene, I mean, the number of listeners became as large as a small FM radio station in Israel. So I decided to try to really make a business out of it. It was a big career change. I was already 40 years old, and I decided to quit my job, started PI Media. And I'm happy to say that now, 5 or 6 years later, we're producing about 30 podcasts in Hebrew, in English, for Israeli, for international audiences, lots and lots of topics. Probably around 40 or 50 people are now involved in some way or the other in making these podcasts, both as full-time employees of the company or freelance creators and producers. And we're actually the only, I think, podcast production company in Israel. There are perhaps, independent artists here and there, but we are probably the biggest and the most, let's say, important in the podcasting market in Israel.
With all your experience as a producer, Ran, it's obvious that you have an understanding of how to produce a podcast and editing in particular. You've written a few blogs about this. Why do you think editing is important?
Editing is probably, I can't say if it's the most important thing, but I think it's a necessity. Without good editing, a podcast can have great content, but it won't succeed, from my experience. So why is that? First thing is the actual, what I call the first impression of the listener. The first time somebody listens to your show, you usually have in the vicinity of like 10, 20 seconds for the listener until the listener kind of makes up his mind as to the quality of your show. And one of the best ways to improve the quality of the show is to edit out on the basic level noises, sounds that are kind of maybe interfering in the background, a truck drives by or whatever. If you don't edit your show, you take the risk that the listener will decide after 10, 20 seconds that your show is amateurish. And once that frame of mind sets in, it's very hard to change it. I think editing is even a more, let's say, an important aspect of what makes a show great. Because there are, hundreds of thousands of podcasts online. And we are all trying to break up above the noise and make our show be more prominent. And we all want to have an opportunity to say something meaningful, to make our show an art, to make it stand out among the crowd. You can't do that without editing. There are a handful of people who are so good in front of a microphone, or their content is so fantastically written and narrated that they require absolutely no editing. Most of us, the real people, we do interviews that are not always uniform in their quality, how interesting they are throughout the interview. We make mistakes when we narrate. It's natural. So if you really want to stand out above the crowd, you need to find a way to make your show better. And editing is the key. There's no way to improve a show without editing, from my experience.
Other than editing mistakes, what do you think are some of the common mistakes that you've noticed with other podcasts that they could improve upon?
The first one is the tendency to make self-deprecating comments about yourself during the show. Not too many people think about it, but I hear lots of podcasters while they're having fun in the studio, talking to their mates and, maybe joking around, saying stuff like, our show sucks. Nobody's listening to us. It seems obvious when you're looking at it from the outside, but these kinds of self-deprecating comments are a turn off for the audience. Nobody wants to be the only one listening to a crappy show. Don't say that what you're doing is lousy, because then people will believe you. That's the problem. So that's the first thing that not too many think about. But then there are the more mainstream mistakes that I see people making. For example, copyright infringement. Copyright infringement is very, very common for novice podcasters. They incorporate copyrighted music, copyrighted movies, scenes from movies, etc. And that's a deadly mistake. Nowadays, in the technological world, we're coming very rapidly to a point in which copyright infringement lawsuits will be handled by software, not by human beings, in the sense that there are bots now scraping the net, looking for MP3 files of podcasts. They'll go to your archive and find shows that you did like 5-6 years ago. They'll scan the files. They'll recognize the same way that they scan YouTube videos nowadays. They'll find an infringement, and then the lawsuit or the threatening letter from an attorney is automatically posted on the mail. So there are no humans involved, and when you're doing such an infringement, you are exposing yourself to a risk that might actually hurt you 5 or 6 years or 10 years from now. Another thing is not host your podcast on YouTube. It's very tempting to upload your show to YouTube and maybe put on a slide or something, and that's it. I mean, hey, we've got a podcast in the air. People can listen. But
well, can I just say that I think I've heard a few times that people think that it's because it's the biggest search engine in the world, or the second biggest search engine in the world, and there are so many people on the platform that it makes sense that they should put their audio on the platform too, to access that many people.
We should make the distinction between having a podcast, a real audio podcast with its own website and hosting service, and then just posting the same files on YouTube as well, as a kind of way to access new listeners who might not have been exposed to your podcast. That's fine. That's fine. Your main podcast is hosted as a podcast on some real-world hosting service, Podbean, Libsyn, whatever, and that's fine. From my experience, there's not too much added benefit of actually posting podcasts to YouTube as well. I've tried everything. None of my podcasts, all of my podcasts regularly get 50,000 downloads per episode, but none of them have passed the 500 listeners mark on YouTube. So it's a matter of how much time you have on your hands, probably, if you want to do that. I'm not doing it because it's relatively unimportant. What I'm talking about, the mistake that I'm referring to, is solely hosting your podcast on YouTube. And just posting audio with a slide on YouTube and saying, that's my podcast. And that's a mistake, because YouTube is not a platform which is suitable for audio consumption. Think about it. On mobile phones, YouTube has to be open on the screen. You can't close the screen, darken the screen, and YouTube will keep playing. It has to be open. And once it's open, it means that you can't do anything with the phone except listening to the show. So nobody does that. No, even if you place the phone next to you and somebody touches the screen, now the podcast stops playing and it wastes the battery, of course, because it's video on screen. So it's not working as a platform. That's one reason. The other is a bit more subtle, and it has to do with control over your listeners and subscribers. Here I'm talking in my position as a businessman, as someone who tries to build a business out of podcasting. The deadliest sin from the business perspective is not having any control over your listeners and subscribers. Think about it. When you're posting a video to YouTube and somebody subscribes to your channel, for example, he's not subscribing to your channel. He's subscribing to a channel which is on YouTube. You, as the producer, the publisher of the content, have zero knowledge of who subscribed to your show, and you have zero knowledge of whether somebody has decided to leave your subscription base for some reason. And if you, God forbid, want to quit YouTube in the future and move to another hosting service, or in the worst case, if YouTube for some reason kicked you out for, I don't know, you did something which is against the laws of the platform, those subscribers are gone.
Maybe let's turn it around and think about, maybe take a positive spin. And are there any podcasts out there that you think are well produced that you like to listen to, and why?
Lots and lots, thankfully. I mean, my first and most important experience as a listener was listening to NPR shows. And I usually try to listen to the NPR's shows twice. Once as a listener just to enjoy the show, whatever. And the second time as a professional to try to understand what are the things that they are doing, the small things that kind of make them stand out of the crowd. That's what makes them so popular and so successful. And I learn a lot from listening to how, for example, Jad Abumrad from Radiolab, who's considered one of the top radio producers in the United States, how he constructs a story around audio scenes, the way he uses music and effects and inserts from interviews. So here I both listen to them, and then I go online and find interviews that people interviewed them on their methods of interviewing to understand what is their way of thinking. Why do they ask the questions that they ask? Trying to get inside their mind and see how they decide who to interview, what kind of interviews are they looking for in terms of more professional, more emotional. And because interviews are such an integral part of podcasting, I mean, I don't know, 90% of all podcasts, if not more, are interview-based. It's extremely important to understand the basics of that skill. You have to learn the craft. I mean, there are only a handful of people who are great at this right from the get-go. They have some sort of a natural talent. Most of us need to learn. And one of the downsides of podcasting, because it's independent and you can do podcast from your living room or whatever, people tend not to dig deep and learn the craft. And then they probably stay, as I said, below the noise level of the internet. If you want to rise above the noise, learn the craft. I mean, if you were to build a chair, you could build a chair in your living room. It's possible. Would you sell that chair in a store? Would somebody buy it from you? I don't think so. Why would anybody listen to what you have to say for an hour or half an hour if you're not really trying to perfect your art, your craft? It's something that lots of people don't realize when they begin. You can do that as a kind of a hobby, But then why bother? I mean, just open a blog. It's easier. Podcasting is hard.
I love that analogy with the chair. That's absolutely perfect. Now, final question, Ran. For you, what's the future look for you as a podcast producer, as an owner of a podcast company? And what's the future, do you think, for podcasting in general?
That's a question that I'm thinking about constantly. I think that we're heading very quickly into a future in which FM radio is gone. FM as a technology has no reason to exist in a few years. Everybody is going online. We'll have streaming. Now, streaming, there are two ways to consume, or two genres or whatever, to consume audio. One is on demand, and the other is real time. Real time is news, sporting events, etc. That's not for podcasting. That's not our strength. We need, for these kinds of shows, there's still a need for radio-like, the people who are producing these shows, journalists on the ground, some sort of like a newspaper kind of system organization going on in the background. That's not podcasting. Podcasting will take over what we see as on-demand, radio on-demand. So there will be probably no more podcasting as a name or as a class of audio, but just audio on demand. Just like television is dividing to regular channels, transmitting linear television 24 hours, whatever, and on demand, the Netflix of the world, HBOs, whatever. And I think podcasting is going to take at least half of what we see now in the radio world. More people will want to listen to on-demand content. Podcasting now, there will be transformed into more on-demand kind of platforms in the more general sense. I think that we are seeing the process right now before our eyes. Spotify is digging deeper into podcasts. I think that they are now seeing this direction going on. It will probably take some time, but not as long as it took television. Television took something like, I think, 15 years to transform from solely linear television to part of it being on demand, Netflix and such. In audio, because audio is technically simpler, we should be seeing that in the next 5 to 10 years even. So I build my business here in Israel as a kind of a gateway, as a portal of actually being not only podcast in the narrow sense of the word, but on-demand audio in general, whether it's in cars, in applications, whatever, wherever people can consume audio on demand.
That's fascinating. I really appreciate your time, Ran. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom, and good luck with everything that you do in the future.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was a pleasure. And I invite the listeners to listen to my English podcast, Malicious Life, about the history of cybersecurity and hacking. If you're into these kinds of stories from the past, the dark past of technology, Malicious Life is the podcast.
That's Ran Levi. Now, Nick, one talking point that he mentioned was about streaming and how FM, he thinks, will be gone soon, and that streaming will be the thing that replaces it. So audio content on demand, and it reflects what we're doing with video on demand. I think he's right, and particularly the younger generation are growing up with things on demand. So that's what they're used to, and that's what they're going to be doing mostly, and forget about radio.
Yeah, and if you want it live, then you get a streaming version rather than a traditional radio. I must admit, I don't listen to the radio in the car anymore. I predominantly listen to podcasts. And if I do want to listen to one of my favourite radio shows, I generally stream it through TuneIn Radio or one of those.
Same here, absolutely.
I almost fell off my chair, though, when he said that podcasting will take half of radio. If you think about that in dollar terms, if it took 10%, that would be astronomical. So that's going to be enormous for the podcasting and streaming space.
It will be. I don't know it's hard to predict the future, although I did it at the start of this podcast, but you don't know how exactly it's going to shift and shape. There's still a lot of people out there who, want to listen to the updated information on the radio, but how exactly it's going to fit in, I don't know. One other thing he talked about was, as a podcast producer, how he listens to things twice. So NPR podcasts, he listens for the enjoyment, but he goes back and he listens to understand the craft of doing a podcast. And I think that's great to hear him say that, because that's what I do as well. How did they do that? Why did they do it that way? And the other thing, don't upload to YouTube. I mean, certainly don't upload only to YouTube. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, don't host on YouTube.
Don't host on YouTube, yeah.
You can upload, if you want to upload your podcast as an additional place on YouTube, he said that's fine. Yeah. He doesn't bother because what he said, he averages 50,000 downloads to his podcast and he gets about 500
that's right.
on YouTube. Why would you bother?
Exactly.
I think just to finish, Chris, I loved his point about the importance of editing. We obviously understand that here. We edit everything very tightly. But he even took it to that next level of saying you've only got 10 to 20 seconds, in his opinion, to grab the attention of your prospective listener. And if you don't do something great, you ain't going to get them.
That's it. You might get them for that episode, but they'll never come back, I reckon. No, it was good speaking with Ran.
Yeah, it was a really good interview, Chris, and I look forward to having a listen to Malicious Life. Well, that's it for another episode of Podcasting Essentials. For more about us and how we can help you use audio content to build engagement, you can go to be.com.au. From all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.